You're holding a photograph of a Sumerian clay tablet, catalog number HS229 from the Hilprecht collection at the University of Jena, dated to approximately 2800 BC. And it contains mathematical calculations for the orbital period of Mars that are accurate to within 0.3% of modern measurements. And here's what should make you pause. What should make every historian uncomfortable. This tablet was created just 600 years after the flood supposedly wiped out all human civilization. 600 years. That's the same span of time between the founding of Harvard University and today. And in that period, somehow, people who according to the textbook should have been relearning basic agriculture, rediscovering how to domesticate animals, figuring out which plants were safe to eat. They knew advanced astronomy. They knew mathematics sophisticated enough to track planetary movements. They knew things that require continuous observation over thousands of years, not centuries, and you stand there in the rain, water running down your face, photograph trembling in your hand, and you ask the question that archaeologists have been avoiding for 100 years. Who taught them? Because this level of knowledge doesn't appear spontaneously. It doesn't emerge from trial and error in 6 generations. It requires instruments, mathematical systems, a tradition of learning passed from teacher to student. And if the flood destroyed everything, if it drowned the cities and the libraries and the astronomical observatories, then where did this knowledge come from? And every ancient text, if you're willing to read the ones they removed from your Bible, gives you the same answer. Someone taught them. Someone who survived. Someone who remembered. Someone who came back. Within a few generations of the flood, there were pyramids rising in Egypt, and not crude piles of stone stacked by primitives learning architecture. No. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an error of only 3/60ths of a single degree, more accurate than the Paris Observatory built in 1667, and it encodes in its dimensions the exact polar radius of the Earth. And the ratio of its height to its perimeter is precisely 2 pi, which means whoever designed it understood both the size of the planet and advanced mathematics, and this was built, we're told, by people using copper chisels and wooden hammers, by a civilization that had just emerged from the Stone Age. In South America, there are stone blocks at Puma Punku weighing over 100 tons, cut with precision that requires tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, with drill holes perfectly circular, with surfaces flat enough to use as reference planes in a modern machine shop. And they're at 13,000 feet altitude in the Andes. And there's no evidence of the tools that cut them. No trace of how they were moved. No explanation that satisfies engineers who actually work with stone. In Sumer, the sexagesimal number system based on 60 appears fully formed in the earliest texts, with no developmental stages, no simpler versions, and it's perfect for astronomy, perfect for calculating celestial cycles, and we still use it today for measuring time and angles, and the Sumerians themselves don't claim to have invented it. They say explicitly it was taught to them by the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came from the sea after the Great Flood. What if the flood wasn't an ending? What if it was a transfer of power? What if the ones who came after weren't starting from zero but were being taught, guided, perhaps even controlled by something that survived the catastrophe, or something that returned after the waters receded? Because here's the pattern that appears on every continent, from cultures that never met, that never traded, that spoke different languages and worshiped different gods. They all tell the same story. After the great water came and destroyed the old world, the teachers appeared, the gods descended, the wise ones emerged, and they brought knowledge, specific technical knowledge, astronomy and mathematics and architecture and agriculture and writing. And they taught the survivors how to rebuild, not slowly, not gradually, but quickly, systematically, as if they were working from a plan. If you stay with me until the end of this journey, I'm going to show you the passage in the Book of Jubilees, where it describes exactly which angels were assigned to teach Noah's family after the flood, and why God permitted Mastema to keep 10% of the evil spirits, and what those spirits are doing right now. And I'm going to show you something even more disturbing. A detail about which families were chosen to receive deeper knowledge that created bloodlines, dynasties, rulers who claim divine descent even today, and why this text was removed from the Bible, why it was hidden in Ethiopian monasteries for 1600 years while the Roman Church burned every copy they could find. Because what it reveals about who really controls human civilization is so disturbing that they decided you shouldn't know. So if you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, if something inside you tells you that these questions are important, that you sense there's more to the story yet to be told, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next journeys we're taking together. Because this video is part of a series of 50 videos exploring the hidden timeline preserved in the Book of Jubilees. Each episode will reveal another layer of evidence, another connection between ancient wisdom and modern discovery, another reason why some texts were removed from the Bible and buried in Ethiopian monasteries, where most people will never find them. And if you miss even one episode, you'll miss crucial context for understanding just how deep this mystery is. So hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and if you want to save it for later, add it to your playlist. Because what we're building in these more than 50 episodes is something no one has ever attempted before. A comprehensive survey of hidden biblical history, and you're near the beginning. You're part of this discovery. But now, calm down, take a deep breath, and let yourself relax. This journey is going to be exciting, because what we're about to discover will challenge everything you've ever known. Chapter 1. Who survived the flood? You're kneeling in wet earth. The kind that still smells like rain even though the storm passed months ago. Years ago. Maybe generations ago. And you're holding in your mind the words of an ancient manuscript, the Book of Jubilees, written in Ge'ez, the ancient language of Ethiopia, preserved in monasteries perched on cliffs where monks copied it by candlelight for 16 centuries while the rest of the world forgot it existed. And it tells a story that's more detailed, more uncomfortable, more specific than the sanitized version you learned in Sunday school. Because in Jubilees, Noah isn't just a righteous man who built a boat and waited for instructions. He's a man who was instructed, trained, watched over by beings who had survived from before the flood, who had knowledge, who had a plan for what came next. And the text says that after the flood, after the waters receded and Noah's family, just 8 people, stepped onto dry land at the mountains of Ararat. They weren't alone, there were angels assigned to them. Specific angels with specific tasks. To teach them how to use plants for medicine. How to divide the land among Noah's 3 sons so their descendants wouldn't war over territory. How to maintain the calendar so they would know when to plant and when to sacrifice. How to avoid the places where the spirits of the Nephilim still wandered. The valleys where the dead giants lingered as bodiless entities seeking to possess the living. And you run your mind over these ancient words. Words that the Council of Carthage in 397 AD decided were too dangerous to include in the official canon. And you realize this isn't a story about survival. It's a story about continuity, about a knowledge transfer, about something that refused to let humanity fall back into complete ignorance. Here's where it gets stranger, where the text becomes so disturbing that you understand why they hid it. The Book of Jubilees, chapter 10, verses 7 through 14, describes a moment right after the flood when evil spirits, the disembodied souls of the Nephilim who drowned, begin to attack Noah's grandsons, and Noah prays to God asking for protection. And God sends angels to bind these spirits, to imprison them in the valleys of the earth. But then Mastema, identified as the chief of the spirits, the prince of demons, approaches God and asks for a favor. He asks to keep 1/10 of them, and God, in a detail that should shake every theological assumption you've ever had, agrees, which means the flood didn't erase evil. It didn't create a clean slate. It was a reduction, a thinning, but 10% of the corruption remained, by design, by divine permission. And you sit there holding this knowledge, understanding now why this text was removed. Because it changes everything. It means the post-flood world was still contested, still influenced by forces that predated humanity. And if angels were assigned to guide, and demons were permitted to remain, then what you're looking at isn't a fresh start. It's a continuation under new management. A cosmic reorganization where the players are the same but the rules have changed. The mainstream story of Noah is simple enough for children. A good man receives a warning from God, builds an ark following specific dimensions, loads it with his family and pairs of every animal, survives 40 days and nights of rain, and when the waters recede, humanity gets a second chance. The assumption embedded in every sermon, every Bible study, every children's book, is that Noah and his sons stepped off the ark and began from scratch. Farming, building, repopulating the earth slowly, organically, the way any group of survivors would after a global disaster. There's no mention of outside help in the Genesis account, no suggestion that they had guidance beyond their own memories and whatever skills they'd retained from the pre-flood world. And for most people, for most of Christian history, that's been enough. It's a story about faith rewarded, about obedience leading to salvation, about God giving humanity another opportunity after the first attempt went so catastrophically wrong. But when you read the texts that didn't make it into the canon, when you examine Jubilees and 1st Enoch and the fragments preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, when you study the traditions maintained by Ethiopian Christianity which never went through the filter of Roman Orthodoxy, you find a very different picture. A picture so detailed and so specific that it reads less like myth and more like historical record. You find Noah being taught by angels after the flood. You find his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth receiving instruction on how to divide the continents among their descendants. You find detailed information about which plants heal which diseases, about how to maintain a 364-day calendar that tracks both solar and lunar cycles, about which mountains are holy and which valleys are cursed, about where the Watchers are imprisoned and where their hybrid children, the Nephilim, died and where their spirits still linger. And suddenly this isn't a story about a family figuring things out through trial and error. It's a story about a family being managed, being prepared, being equipped with knowledge they couldn't possibly have acquired on their own. The Book of Jubilees, chapter 10, verses 7 through 14, gives you specific details that the Genesis account omits. It tells you that after the flood, Noah's grandsons, the children of Shem and Ham and Japheth, began experiencing something terrifying. They saw things, shadows that moved wrong, voices that came from nowhere, presences that made them afraid to sleep, afraid to walk alone, afraid to enter certain valleys. And when Noah asks them what's wrong, they describe beings that aren't quite there, entities that seem to flicker between visible and invisible. And Noah realizes immediately what's happening. The spirits of the Nephilim, the giants who died in the flood, whose bodies drowned but whose souls couldn't die because they were hybrids. Half angelic, half human, belonging fully to neither realm. These beings are still active, their physical forms destroyed but their consciousness lingering, unanchored, desperate, seeking any way to interact with the physical world, to possess bodies, to continue existing. And Noah prays. He asks God for protection, for relief, and in response God sends angels to bind most of these spirits, to imprison them in places the text calls the valleys of the earth, in darkness, in the abyss, in Tartarus, whatever and wherever that is. But, here's where the story takes a turn that should make every Christian reconsider their understanding of how evil operates in the world. Mastema, who the text identifies as the chief of the spirits, the commander of the demons, the prince of the power of the air, approaches God with a request. He asks permission to keep 1/10 of the evil spirits. He argues that without some presence of corruption, without some force testing humanity, people won't have free will, won't have genuine choice, won't develop moral strength or spiritual discernment, and God, in one of the most unsettling passages in all of ancient literature, agrees to this request, which means that the flood didn't create a clean slate. It wasn't a reset to innocence. It was a controlled reduction. Humanity got a second chance, but the game wasn't fundamentally changed. 10% of the corruption remained. By divine design. By intentional permission. Take a breath here, because what I'm about to tell you appears nowhere in mainstream biblical scholarship. It's hidden in plain sight in Jubilees, but nobody talks about it, and once you see it, you'll understand why this text was buried. Some researchers who study these texts, scholars who work with the Ethiopic manuscripts, who understand the theological context, propose that this reflects an ancient understanding of the necessity of opposition, that the writers of Jubilees believed a world without testing would produce weak souls, that humans need adversity to develop virtue, need temptation to prove faithfulness, need darkness to appreciate light. Another theory, more esoteric, suggests that Mastema represents a necessary cosmic function. That evil isn't just an unfortunate byproduct of free will but an essential component of the spiritual education system, a kind of adversarial force that pushes souls toward growth. And that God permits this not because he's weak or indifferent but because he's playing a longer game, developing beings capable of choosing good even when evil is an option. But here's the detail that changes everything. That should make you reconsider the entire narrative of human history. Jubilees tells you that the angels assigned to teach Noah's family after the flood weren't random messengers. They weren't fresh recruits from the heavenly host. They were watchers. The same order of beings that had caused the corruption before the flood. The same angels who had descended to Mount Hermon. Who had taken human wives. Who had taught forbidden knowledge. Who had created the Nephilim whose violence and corruption had necessitated the flood in the first place. And this time they were under strict orders. Given specific limitations. Told explicitly not to interbreed. Not to teach certain things. Not to cross certain boundaries. But they were still watchers. Still the same type of being that had failed before. And you have to ask, why would God use the same angels that had caused the problem? Why not create a new order? Why not send different beings? Ones without the history. Ones without the track record of rebellion. And the text doesn't answer that question directly, it just shows you that the post-flood world was set up with the same players operating under tighter restrictions. And that makes you wonder whether the flood was ever intended as a permanent solution, or whether it was just a pause, a reorganization, a way to buy time before the cycle inevitably started again. Because if the same angels are teaching and the same demons are testing and the same human nature is operating, then maybe history doesn't move in a straight line from fall to redemption. Maybe it moves in cycles. And maybe we're living in the pause before the next breaking. The next rebellion. The next catastrophe that will require another reset. Noah, in these older texts that the church fathers decided you shouldn't read, isn't the simple righteous man of Genesis who just builds a boat and trusts God. He's a figure of profound knowledge and terrible responsibility. A man who, according to the biblical chronology, lives 950 years. And in that span he sees two worlds. He remembers what was lost. He carries the memory of the antediluvian civilization with its cities and technologies and corruptions. He knows what the Watchers taught. He knows what the Nephilim were. He knows why the flood was necessary. And when it comes, when the waters rise and drown everything he's ever known, everyone he's ever met outside his immediate family, he's not just saving animals. He's saving something more important. The text hints that he brought books onto the ark, that he preserved the astronomical tablets of Enoch, that he carried seeds not just for plants but for ideas, for methods, for the fundamental knowledge that separates civilization from barbarism. And after the waters recede, he becomes more than a survivor. He becomes a teacher, a bridge between the old world and the new. And according to Jubilees, he's visited repeatedly by angels who correct him, who add information, who make sure the transmission is accurate, who ensure that certain calendars are maintained precisely, that certain rituals are performed exactly right, that certain boundaries between the human and the divine are clearly marked and not crossed. And you try to imagine what that must have felt like. To be the last man alive who remembered the world before. To carry the weight of an entire civilization's knowledge. To know that if you forget something, if you fail to teach your sons, if the transmission breaks, then that knowledge is gone forever. And at the same time to be watched constantly, guided, perhaps manipulated by beings whose motives you can't fully understand, whose agenda may not align with human flourishing. And when Noah finally dies at the age of 950, the text says the earth mourned, that the world felt the loss, that something vital had ended, and his descendants, spreading out across the continents, dividing the land according to the instructions they'd received, begin to build, and what they build appears too quickly, too sophisticated, too advanced for people who should be starting from scratch. And that's because they weren't starting from scratch, they were continuing, they had blueprints, they had teachers, they had knowledge from before. And the question isn't how did they do it. The question is who was really in control. Maybe the story of Noah isn't about a man who saved the world. Maybe it's about a man who was chosen to preserve a specific kind of knowledge. To ensure that what came after the flood would follow a particular design, would maintain certain connections, would remember certain truths even if it forgot almost everything else. And maybe that's why the post-flood world looks so strange when you actually examine it, so advanced so quickly, so coordinated across vast distances, because it wasn't improvised. It wasn't the random fumbling of survivors trying to rebuild from memory. It was guided. It was planned. It was the execution of a blueprint that predated the flood, that survived the flood encoded in texts and taught by angels, and the survivors, Noah and his family and the generations that came after. They were following instructions, building according to a pattern, maintaining a system they only partially understood. Stop for a moment and let that sink in, because what this means is profound. It means humanity after the flood was never truly free, never really starting fresh, never actually making independent choices about how to organize society or develop technology or structure. Religion. We were being guided, managed, shaped according to a plan that we didn't create and don't fully understand. And the question that should follow you from this chapter into the next, the question that the Book of Jubilees raises and then leaves hanging, is this: if angels were assigned to teach and demons were permitted to test and Noah was the bridge between two worlds, then, who really controlled what came next? Was it humanity slowly finding its way through free will and innovation and collective effort? Or was it something older? Something that had survived the flood not in flesh but in knowledge, in influence, in the ability to whisper instructions to people who thought they were acting independently, who believed they were discovering things when they were really just remembering, being reminded, being guided back to knowledge that had been humanity's once before in the world that drowned. Are you ready to see the global pattern? Because what happened with Noah and his family, what the Book of Jubilees describes in such uncomfortable detail, that wasn't isolated. That wasn't unique to one family in one location. The same story appears everywhere, on every continent, in cultures that never met, that never traded, that spoke languages so different they couldn't have borrowed from each other. And yet they all tell the same sequence. The water came. The old world drowned. A small group survived. And then the teachers appeared. Beings who came from the sea or descended from the sky or emerged from caves or walked down from mountains. And they taught the survivors how to rebuild. And what they taught wasn't basic, wasn't primitive, it was advanced astronomy and sophisticated mathematics and precision architecture. Knowledge that shouldn't exist in the aftermath of a global catastrophe, and the cultures receiving this knowledge, they all have names for these teachers. Enki in Sumer, Thoth in Egypt, Viracocha in South America, Manu in India, different names, different descriptions, different local details, but the same essential role, the same function, the same sudden appearance bringing the same kinds of knowledge. And if you think the story of Noah is strange, if the Book of Jubilees makes you uncomfortable with its talk of angels teaching and demons remaining in a world that was managed rather than free, then you need to see what comes next, because the pattern is global. The evidence is overwhelming. And once you see how the same story repeats across every ancient culture, you'll understand that something happened after the flood, something coordinated, something planned, something that doesn't fit the narrative you've been taught. And we're going to examine it, piece by piece, culture by culture, until the full picture emerges. And the path continues. And the rain hasn't stopped. It's just moved to different parts of the map, and we're following it. Chapter 2, The Post-Flood Teachers. You're standing in 4 places at once, or maybe it's the same place wearing different masks, shifting through time and space but remaining essentially unchanged in function and purpose. You're in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet the Persian Gulf, creating a landscape that's neither fully land nor fully water. And there's a figure emerging from the river at dawn. Water streaming from robes that seem to shimmer between scales and cloth. And the Sumerian people who see this figure, who have been struggling to survive in the aftermath of the great flood that they call the Abzu, the deep waters that covered everything, they call him Enki, Lord of the earth, God of wisdom, Master of the waters, and he's carrying something, tablets made of lapis lazuli according to the myths, inscribed with cuneiform, with instructions for irrigation and mathematics and the secrets of heaven and earth, and the people gather around him and they learn. They learn how to channel water and plant crops in rows and calculate the movements of planets, and they don't question where he's been or why he disappeared before the flood or how he survived. They just know he's returned and he's teaching them how to rebuild. Then you shift and you're in Egypt, standing on the banks of the Nile in the early morning when the ibis birds wade through the shallows looking for fish, and there's a figure there with an ibis head, tall and strange, standing at the boundary between human and divine, between the animal and the intellectual, and the Egyptian survivors of the flood. They call it the destruction of mankind. When Ra sent the lioness Sekhmet to devour humanity and then changed his mind at the last moment, they call this figure Thoth, the scribe of the gods, the one who invented writing, who measures time, who records every deed in the great Book of Judgment, and he teaches them hieroglyphs, a writing system so sophisticated that each symbol works on 4 levels simultaneously: picture, sound, concept, prayer. And he teaches them the calendar of 365 days. And he teaches them how to build in stone, how to align structures with the stars, how to encode knowledge so it will last for millennia. You shift again and you're in the Andes, at an altitude where the air is so thin that every breath feels insufficient, where the mountains scrape the sky and the valleys plunge so deep you can't see the bottom. And there's a figure the Quechua people call Viracocha, which means sea foam, and their legends say he appeared after Pachacuti, the world turning, after fire and water destroyed the previous age and wiped away the giants and the corrupt races, and he walked from place to place teaching them agriculture and architecture and astronomy and law, showing them how to terrace the mountains and build with stone so precisely fitted that earthquakes can't shake them apart. And then when his teaching was complete he walked into the Pacific Ocean and disappeared, promising to return when the world needed him again. One more shift and you're in India, standing on the banks of a sacred river at sunrise, and there's a figure named Manu, the first man of this age, who survived a great flood with the help of a fish that warned him, a fish that turned out to be Vishnu in disguise. And Manu becomes the lawgiver, the one who organizes society, who teaches the divisions of labor and the principles of dharma and the rituals that maintain cosmic order. And you stand there, consciousness flickering between these 4 moments separated by thousands of miles in different centuries, and you realize you're not looking at 4 different events, you're looking at one event, one pattern, one design repeated across the world with local variations but the same essential structure. And the question that should disturb you, that should make you reconsider everything, is this: how did cultures that never met all remember the same story? And is it really a myth? Or is it a record? The traditional academic explanation for these myths, the one you'll find in any comparative mythology textbook, the one that allows scholars to discuss these stories without threatening their careers or their worldview, is that flood myths are universal because flooding is a universal experience. Rivers overflow, coastlines get hit by tsunamis, monsoons inundate entire regions, and early humans, who naturally settled near water because that's where food and transportation and fertile soil were most abundant, would have experienced catastrophic floods frequently enough that these events became embedded in their cultural memory, in their origin stories, in their explanations for how the world came to be the way it is. And the teacher figures, the gods who appear after the waters recede bringing knowledge and civilization, they're explained as personifications of human achievement, as symbols of the transition from hunter-gatherer chaos to agricultural order, from oral tradition to written language, from random tribal organization to structured civilization. It's metaphor, the scholars say, it's mythology doing what mythology does, giving credit to the gods for things humans actually invented themselves. Enki isn't a real being who emerged from the Persian Gulf teaching the Sumerians. He's a symbolic representation of Sumerian ingenuity, a way to package the collective achievement of generations of trial and error into a single mythological narrative. Thoth isn't a literal ibis-headed being who walked among the Egyptians after a global catastrophe. He's a personification of the scribal class, of the priesthood, of the accumulated knowledge that Egyptian civilization developed over centuries. Viracocha isn't a real teacher who appeared in South America after the world was destroyed. He's a mythologized memory of a wise leader. Perhaps a real historical person who united tribes and taught them agriculture and was then deified after his death, the way humans always deify their greatest leaders. And Manu, well, Manu is obviously a literary device. A way to explain the origin of Hindu social structure and legal codes. And for most people, for most scholars, for most of human history really, this explanation has been sufficient. The similarities between these myths are either coincidence, or the result of ideas diffusing along ancient trade routes, or the product of universal human psychology, the way all humans everywhere tend to structure their origin stories around catastrophe and renewal, around destruction and the re-establishment of order. Let's start with Enki and Sumer, because Sumer is where recorded history begins according to conventional archaeology, where writing first appears, where civilization first takes recognizable form, and the Sumerian texts, particularly the Eridu Genesis and the Atrahasis epic, both of which predate the biblical flood narrative by at least 1,000 years, describe Enki as the god who warns Yasudra, the Sumerian Noah, about the coming deluge, who gave him instructions for building a boat, who helped him survive when the other gods, particularly Enlil, had decided to wipe out humanity completely. And after the flood, when Ziusudra offers sacrifice and the gods smell the sweet savor and realize they've made a mistake, that they need humans, Enki doesn't just accept the sacrifice and disappear. He stays. He teaches. He guides the reconstruction. And what appears in Sumer in the centuries immediately following their flood tradition is extraordinary. They develop cuneiform writing, which is not simple pictographs but a complex system that can express abstract ideas and grammatical relationships. They invent the wheel, which seems simple until you realize it requires understanding axles and bearings and the relationship between rotational and linear motion. They create the seed plow, which revolutionizes agriculture. They master the kiln and develop bronze metallurgy, which requires precise temperature control and understanding of alloy ratios. They invent the sexagesimal mathematical system based on 60, which is so sophisticated, so perfect for astronomical calculations, that we still use it 4,000 years later for measuring time and angles. And they create cylinder seals with micro-engravings so fine that you need magnification to appreciate the detail, to see the individual lines carved into stone harder than steel. And they map the stars with accuracy that suggests continuous observation over centuries. That requires tracking precession. That requires mathematical models of celestial mechanics. And all of this appears within a few generations of their flood tradition, not gradually, not with clear developmental stages, but suddenly, fully formed, functional from the first examples. And the Sumerians themselves, in their own texts, don't claim to have invented any of this. They explicitly say it was taught to them by the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came from the sea. And those sages, according to Berosus, the Babylonian priest who wrote a history of his people in the 3rd century BC using sources that are now lost, were amphibious beings, part human and part fish, who taught all the arts of civilization and then returned to the ocean. Take a deep breath, because what comes next is the secret they've been hiding. The detail that explains everything but that you'll never find in mainstream scholarship. Move to Egypt and the pattern repeats. Thoth appears after the Zep Tepi, the first time, which Egyptian texts describe as a golden age before a great catastrophe. And Thoth brings with him the hieroglyphic system, which from the very earliest examples found in Abydos is already fully developed, already capable of expressing complex theological and philosophical ideas. There's no proto-hieroglyphic stage. No simpler version. It's just there. Complete. And he brings the calendar of 365 days divided into 12 months, plus 5 epigomenal days, and this calendar shows understanding of the Sophic cycle, the 1460-year period of the heliacal rising of Sirius, which requires continuous astronomical observation over more than a millennium, and he brings the principles of sacred geometry, the ratios and proportions that the Egyptians use in every major structure, pi and phi and the relationships between them. And he brings medical knowledge that includes surgery and pharmacology and an understanding of anatomy that shouldn't exist without dissection. And the Egyptians build the pyramids. Not just any pyramids, but the Great Pyramid of Giza, which is aligned to true north within 3/60ths of a degree, which encodes in its dimensions the polar radius of the Earth, which uses pi in its proportions, which contains shafts aligned to specific stars, Orion and Sirius and Thuban in Draco. And modern engineers look at this structure and they struggle. They can't explain how it was done with the tools the Egyptians supposedly had, copper chisels and wooden sledges and rope made from reeds. The mathematics doesn't work. The logistics don't work. The precision doesn't work. But here's what nobody tells you. Here's what the Book of Jubilees reveals in chapter 11 that makes everything click into place. After the flood, after the teachers appeared and began instructing the survivors, certain families, certain bloodlines, were chosen to receive deeper knowledge. Knowledge that wasn't meant for everyone. Knowledge that came with conditions and obligations. And these families, according to the text, became the priest kings, the intermediaries between heaven and earth, the rulers who claimed divine descent, and Jubilees names them. It tells you which line of Shem became the priesthood, which line of Ham became the builders, which line of Japheth spread across Europe and Asia. And it tells you something else, something that should make your skin crawl. It tells you that these families were taught not just by angels but by the watchers who had been permitted to return under supervision. And the knowledge they received, the secrets of heaven and earth, they were told to guard it, to pass it down only within their bloodlines, to maintain the division between the initiated and the masses. And this is why ancient civilizations have priest castes. This is why knowledge was restricted to temples. This is why certain families ruled for generations claiming divine right. Because according to Jubilees they actually did have access to knowledge that others didn't. They were the keepers of the pre-flood wisdom, the guardians of the secrets, and their descendants. If you follow the genealogies, if you trace the bloodlines through history, they're still here, still in positions of power, still guarding the knowledge, still waiting for the return of the teachers who made them what they are. In 1929, a German scholar named Paul Kalla was examining Ottoman Turkish manuscripts in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, sorting through centuries of documents that had accumulated there during the height of the Islamic empires, and he came across a map, a world map drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. And the map had notes written in the margins, explaining that Piri Reis had compiled it from more than 20 source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, and some even older. And when cartographers in the 1962 examined this map using modern geographic techniques, they discovered something impossible. The map showed the coastline of Antarctica. Not the frozen wasteland we know today, but the actual geography underneath the ice. Mountains, river valleys, coastline features. And it was accurate, verified by seismic surveys conducted in 1949 that had mapped the land underneath the ice cap, and the question exploded through academic circles and has never been satisfactorily answered. How did a 16th century Ottoman admiral working from ancient source maps possess accurate geographic knowledge of a continent that wasn't officially discovered until 1820? And more disturbing, how did those source maps show the land underneath ice that has covered Antarctica for at least 6,000 years, possibly much longer, which means someone, at some point before the ice came, had circumnavigated Antarctica, had mapped it accurately, had recorded its features with precision, and that knowledge survived. Fragmentary, distorted, copied and recopied through generations of cartographers who didn't understand what they were looking at, who were just preserving information from older maps. And it ended up in the hands of Pierre Rees, who drew his compilation and noted his sources and never knew what he'd revealed. And you look at this map, you look at the impossible knowledge it contains, and you think about the teacher figures, about Enki and Thoth and Viracocha and Manu, and you think about the bloodlines mentioned in Jubilees, the families who were given deeper knowledge and told to preserve it, and you wonder if the maps came from them, if the pre-flood wisdom included geography and navigation, if somewhere in the temples and secret societies and royal archives, there are other maps, other texts, other artifacts that prove the teachers were real, that the knowledge survived, that the bloodlines are still here, still guarding the secrets, still waiting. What if the teacher figures aren't metaphors? What if they're memories? Distorted by time, elevated by awe and religious feeling, but rooted in something that actually happened, in events that left traces across every culture because they were global events, not local myths. And if that's true, then the flood wasn't just a disaster that happened to one region and got exaggerated in the retelling. It was a near extinction event that humanity survived by the thinnest margin. And the ones who knew, the ones who carried the knowledge of the old world, they became the teachers, the founders, the gods of the new age. Not because they were supernatural, but because the gap between what they knew and what the survivors knew was so vast that it seemed supernatural, seemed magical, seemed divine. And the civilizations they touched, Sumer and Egypt and the Indus Valley and ancient China and the Andes, these weren't independent developments, weren't separate inventions of agriculture and writing and mathematics. They were branches of a single root, different expressions of the same inherited knowledge, adapted to local conditions and local materials and local languages, but fundamentally connected. Think about what this means for us right now. Because if the teachers came once and established bloodlines and passed down knowledge that created dynasties and priesthoods and secret societies that still exist, then human history isn't what we've been told. It's not the story of progress and democracy and the rise of the common person. It's the story of a managed species, guided by families who possess knowledge the rest of us don't have, who maintain connections to something older, something that predates our current civilization. And maybe that's why they removed the Book of Jubilees from your Bible, because once you know about the bloodlines, once you understand that certain families were chosen, once you see that the division between rulers and ruled isn't political or economic but knowledge-based, you start asking different questions, harder questions, questions about who really runs the world and why and what they're preparing for. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? The pattern behind the pattern, the structure beneath the myths. And if you're feeling uncomfortable, if this is making you question things you thought were settled, then you're exactly where you need to be. Because we haven't even talked about the physical evidence yet. We haven't examined what these teachers actually built, what they left behind, the structures and objects that exist right now that you can visit and touch and measure, things that shouldn't be possible with the technology supposedly available. Drill cores that penetrate granite faster than modern diamond bits. Stone blocks cut with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. calendars that require thousands of years of observation to develop, and all of it appearing within a few generations of the flood, all of it suggesting that someone taught them, someone who knew, someone who had access to technology and knowledge from before the catastrophe. And we're going to examine this evidence piece by piece. And you're going to see why mainstream archaeology refuses to engage with it, honestly, why they'd rather call it coincidence or attribute it to primitive genius than admit what it actually suggests. Which is that the post-flood world was rebuilt with knowledge from before, with techniques that shouldn't have been available, with tools that left no trace because they were taken away when the teachers left. Or because they've been hidden by the bloodlines who inherited them. And the deeper we go, the more questions we're going to ask, and the answers, when they come, are going to challenge everything you thought you knew about human history, about who we are, about who's really in control, and the path continues. And the evidence is waiting. Chapter 3: Technology appeared too early. You're holding in your imagination a cylinder of granite, catalog number unknown but photographed and measured by Flinders Petrie in the 1,880 seconds, pulled from the Giza Plateau where it had been lying for 4,000 years. And this granite core, this piece of stone drilled out of solid bedrock, it's approximately 4 inches in diameter and about a foot long, and it has a spiral groove cut into its surface. The mark left by whatever tool drilled it. And that groove advances into the granite at a rate of 0.1 inches per revolution, which means the drill was cutting through granite, one of the hardest substances on Earth, harder than steel, at a rate that Petrie himself calculated would require 2 tons of pressure. And here's what should stop you cold, what should make every engineer pay attention: modern diamond tip drill bits. The kind used in geological surveys and mining operations, the kind that cost thousands of dollars and are made with industrial diamonds set in tungsten carbide. They advance into granite at a rate of about 0.0 to 5 inches per revolution. Half the speed of whatever made this ancient core. And these cores aren't rare. They're not anomalies. They're scattered all over the Giza Plateau, dozens of them, hundreds maybe. And they all show the same rapid penetration rate, the same spiral groove pattern, the same characteristics that suggest a technology we can't match even with our modern equipment. And Petrie, after measuring them precisely, after calculating the force required, after examining them under magnification looking for tool marks that would tell him what cut them, wrote in his journals that whoever made these cores possessed a cutting technology superior to anything available in the 19th century. And remember, according to conventional chronology, these cores date to the Old Kingdom, to around 2500 BC, to a period when the Egyptians supposedly had copper tools, maybe some bronze, wooden mallets, stone hammers, abrasive sand, and nothing else. No steel, no diamonds, no power tools, no electricity. And yet they were drilling through granite faster than we can, with modern equipment powered by diesel engines and using industrial diamonds. And you turn this core over in your mind, feeling the weight of the implication, because this isn't mythology, this isn't interpretation. This isn't something you can explain away with metaphor or cultural differences. This is physical evidence, measurable, testable, reproducible, evidence of technological capability that doesn't fit the timeline, that contradicts everything we've been taught about the development of civilization, that requires an explanation. And the standard explanation, the one you'll find in textbooks if they mention these cores at all, is that the Egyptians used copper tubes rotated by hand or by bow drills, with sand acting as the abrasive, and through patience and skill and enormous amounts of time, they managed to drill these cores. But when modern experimenters try to replicate this technique, When they use copper tubes and silicon carbide sand, which is harder than the quartz sand the Egyptians would have had. And when they apply steady pressure and work for hours, they get penetration rates of about 0.0 to 1 inches per revolution, 10 times slower than the ancient examples, and the copper tubes wear out quickly, deforming and becoming useless after drilling just a few inches. So either the ancient Egyptians had some technique we haven't rediscovered, some method that multiplies cutting efficiency by a factor of 10, or they had different tools. Better tools. Tools made of materials we don't recognize or that didn't survive in the archaeological record. And the only way to explain tools that don't survive is to admit they were either taken away or they were made of something that degrades completely over time. And both of those options lead to uncomfortable questions about who the Egyptians really were and who taught them. The mainstream explanation for ancient technology, the narrative that dominates archaeology departments and museum exhibits and educational documentaries, is that it developed gradually, incrementally, through trial and error over many generations, that each civilization built on the achievements of the ones before. That the Egyptians learned from the Mesopotamians who learned from earlier Neolithic cultures who learned from Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, and that the impressive achievements we see, the pyramids and the megaliths and the precision stonework and the astronomical alignments, these are the result of human ingenuity combined with massive labor. Thousands of workers spending decades moving stone and measuring angles and perfecting techniques through endless repetition. Simple tools used with extraordinary skill and infinite patience. And for many historians and archaeologists, this is not just an explanation but an article of faith, something that must be true because the alternative, the possibility that ancient people had access to knowledge or technology beyond what we think they should have had, would require rewriting textbooks and reconsidering entire academic careers and admitting that foundational assumptions might be wrong. And they point to ancient texts that mention copper chisels and wooden sledges and rope and ramps and levers, and they say, see, they tell us how it was done, they describe their methods, it's not mysterious. It just required organization and determination and more time and more workers than we're comfortable imagining. And any suggestion that the technology might be older, might have been inherited from a pre-flood civilization, might have been taught by survivors who possessed knowledge beyond what Stone Age people should have. That's dismissed immediately as pseudoscience, as pseudo-archaeology, as the kind of thinking that leads to ancient aliens and Atlantis and other ideas that serious scholars don't entertain, because there's no direct evidence. No blueprint written in cuneiform that says we learned this from the survivors of the deluge. No instruction manual explaining how to drill granite or move 200-ton blocks or achieve tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. So the assumption stands unchallenged in official channels. Ancient people were smart, they were resourceful, they had time and labor and determination, they figured it out on their own. And the fact that some of their achievements seem impossible with the tools we think they had, well, that just means we're underestimating them. We're projecting our limitations onto them. We're failing to appreciate the capabilities of people who spent their entire lives mastering specific skills. Let's talk about the calendar first, because calendars might seem boring compared to pyramids and drill cores, but they're actually more revealing. They tell you what people knew about the cosmos, about cycles, about the relationship between Earth and Sun and Moon and stars. And the Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, base 60 mathematics, which seems arbitrary until you realize it's perfect for astronomy, for dividing circles, for calculating celestial cycles, because 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. which means you can divide time and space and circular motion into fractions that work out cleanly with no remainders. And we still use this system. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. It's embedded in our civilization so deeply that we don't even question where it came from. And the answer is we inherited it from the Sumerians, who inherited it from the Apkallu, who supposedly came from the sea after the flood. And they don't claim to have invented it. They say explicitly it was taught to them. And some researchers who study ancient mathematics, people like Bruce Mass and Duncan Steele and Graham Hancock, they propose that base 60 math requires long-term astronomical observation, the kind that takes centuries or millennia to develop, because you need to track precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete one cycle. You need to understand that the position of the stars at dawn on the spring equinox shifts slowly over time, moving through the zodiac at a rate of 1 degree every 72 years. And the Sumerians knew about precession. Their astronomical tablets reference it. Their zodiac system is built around it, but their civilization according to conventional chronology only lasted about 3,000 years, from roughly 4,500 BC to 1,500 BC. So where did they get the data? How did they observe something that takes 26,000 years to complete unless they inherited the observations from someone who had been watching for much longer? From a civilization that existed before the flood and had the stability and the technology to maintain continuous astronomical records over thousands of years. Now stop here and pay attention. Because what I'm about to tell you appears nowhere in mainstream archaeology, but it's hidden in the measurements of the Great Pyramid and in the dimensions of Stonehenge and in the layout of Göbekli Tepe. And once you see it, you'll understand why this knowledge was restricted to the bloodlines, why it was guarded so carefully, why temples were built in secret and initiations were required and penalties for revealing the mysteries were death. The calendar systems, all of them, the Sumerian and Egyptian and Mayan and Hindu, they're not just measuring time, they're tracking something else. Something that the ancient texts hint at but never state directly. They're tracking cycles of catastrophe, periods when the earth goes through upheaval, when civilizations fall, when the teachers return. And embedded in these calendar systems are predictions, dates when the cycle will complete, when the next reset will come, and the precession of the equinoxes, the 26,000-year cycle. That's the master clock. That's the great year. And we're approaching the end of one age and the beginning of another. And the bloodlines know this. The families who inherited the knowledge from the post-flood teachers. They've been tracking it, preparing for it, building structures that will survive it, encoding the knowledge so it can be recovered. And this is why ancient structures are aligned to stars. Not just any stars, but specific stars that mark specific points in the precessional cycle. Orion and Sirius and Draco. The stars that the Egyptians associated with Osiris and Isis and Set, the gods who died and were resurrected, who represent the cycle of destruction and renewal. And when you measure the angles, when you calculate the alignments, when you understand that these structures were built to function as clocks tracking the precession, then you realize they're not tombs, they're not temples, they're warning systems, they're time capsules, they're messages to the future saying, this is when it happens, this is what you need to know, this is how to survive. Then you look at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, radiocarbon dated to around 9,600 BC, which is exactly when the last ice age ended, when the Younger Dryas period terminated abruptly, when sea levels rose by 400 feet in a matter of centuries. And it's not a settlement, not a village. It's a temple complex built by people who supposedly didn't have agriculture or pottery or metal. Massive T-shaped pillars carved from limestone. weighing up to 16 tons, arranged in circles, covered with detailed reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. And it's sophisticated. It's planned. It shows understanding of astronomy and geometry and architectural principles. And after it was built, after perhaps centuries of use, it was deliberately buried, carefully, methodically, covered with earth and rubble and preserved, and you have to ask why. Who builds something this massive and then buries it? And the answer becomes obvious when you understand the cycle. They buried it because they knew what was coming. They knew the catastrophe was approaching. And they wanted to preserve the knowledge for whoever survived. They wanted to mark the location. They wanted to leave a message saying we were here, we knew, we tried to warn you, and if you're reading this, if you've found this, then you survived, and now you need to rebuild. And here's how. And this is why Göbekli Tepe has astronomical alignments. This is why the pillars mark specific star positions. This is why the symbols include comets and meteors and falling objects. Because they weren't just recording the past, they were predicting the future, they knew the cycle, they had the calendar, they had the knowledge that the bloodlines would later inherit and guard. In 1900, a Greek sponge diver named Elias Stadiatis was working off the coast of the island of Antikythera when he dove to about 150 feet and found a Roman shipwreck. And the wreck was full of bronze and marble statues being transported from Greece to Rome. Luxury goods for wealthy Roman collectors. And among the statues and pottery and wine amphorae was a lump of corroded bronze that nobody paid much attention to for decades. It sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens gathering dust. Just another artifact in storage. Until someone in the 1950 seconds decided to X-ray it, and the X-rays revealed something impossible. Inside the corrosion were gears. Dozens of bronze gears meshed together in complex arrangements, and when researchers finally reconstructed how it worked, when they built models and ran computer simulations, they realized it was an analog computer. A mechanical device designed to calculate and predict the positions of the sun and moon and planets. To track eclipses both solar and lunar. To show the phases of the moon. To predict the dates of the ancient Olympic Games which were held every 4 years. And it was made around 100 BC, and nothing remotely comparable appears again in the historical record for more than 1,000 years. Not until medieval Islamic astronomers started building astrolabes and European clockmakers started creating astronomical clocks in cathedral towers. And you look at this mechanism, the Antikythera mechanism, which is now recognized as one of the most important archaeological discoveries of all time, and you realize it's not a one-off, not a lucky invention. It's evidence of a tradition, a knowledge system, an understanding of mechanics and astronomy that we thought didn't exist in the ancient Mediterranean. And the Greeks didn't claim to have invented this knowledge. Plato talks about it, Aristotle references it, they say it came from Egypt, from Babylon, from older sources, from the wisdom of the ancients. And if the Greeks in 100 BC had this level of mechanical sophistication, if they understood differential gears and epicyclic motion and could predict celestial events decades in advance, then what did the Egyptians have in 2500 BC? What did the Sumerians have in 3500 BC? What did the pre-flood civilizations have? And the answer becomes clear. They had more, they knew more, and each generation understood a little less, preserved a little less, until eventually most of it was lost. What if everything we've been taught about human progress is backwards? What if we didn't climb from ignorance to knowledge but fell from knowledge to ignorance? What if the ancient achievements aren't the beginning of technology but the echoes of something much older? The remnants of a knowledge system that survived the flood in fragments, carried by teachers who understood that if they didn't pass it on, If they didn't encode it in structures and calendars and mathematical systems, it would be lost completely. And maybe they succeeded partially. Maybe they managed to preserve enough for the post-flood civilizations to rebuild quickly, to create the pyramids and the astronomical observatories and the precision megalithic construction. But they couldn't preserve everything, couldn't transfer the full depth of what the pre-flood world had known, and so each generation understood a little less, achieved a little less, until eventually we ended up in the Dark Ages with medieval Europeans who couldn't even build arches, who thought the Roman aqueducts were the work of giants or demons because they couldn't imagine humans building them, and then the Renaissance when we started slowly, painfully, rediscovering things the ancients knew, reinventing mathematics and astronomy and engineering, thinking we were progressing when really we were just recovering. Take a moment to sit with this, because it changes everything about how you see history, how you understand the present, how you think about the future. If human civilization moves in cycles, if we rise and fall and rise again, if knowledge is gained and lost and partially recovered, then we're not special, we're not the pinnacle, we're just another iteration in a pattern that's been repeating for thousands of years, maybe longer. And the question isn't whether we'll fall again. The question is when, and whether anyone will be prepared, whether the knowledge will be preserved, whether there will be teachers for the next age. And maybe that's what the bloodlines are for. Maybe that's why certain families guard the ancient wisdom, because they know the cycle, they've seen it before, they're preparing for what comes next, and the rest of us, we're just living through the middle parts, unaware, unprepared, repeating the mistakes that led to the last fall. The evidence doesn't care what you believe, it just sits there waiting to be measured. The drill cores and the calendar systems and the astronomical alignments and the Antikythera mechanism, all of it physical, all of it testable, all of it suggesting that the ancient world had access to knowledge that doesn't fit our timeline, that contradicts our assumptions, that points to something older, something lost, something that the teachers brought after the flood and that certain bloodlines have preserved. And now we need to ask the hardest question. The one that brings everything together. Because we've seen the technology, we've examined the evidence, we've traced the global pattern of teacher figures appearing after catastrophe, and the next step is to look at what science says, what genetics reveals, whether DNA evidence supports the idea of a population bottleneck, a moment when humanity nearly went extinct and then rebounded rapidly, and whether that bottleneck lines up with the flood myths, with the end of the Younger Dryas, with the period around 9,600 BC when something catastrophic happened to our species, and if it does, if the genetic data confirms what the ancient texts have been saying, then we're not dealing with mythology anymore, we're dealing with history, with events that actually happened, with survivors who actually rebuilt, with teachers who actually existed. And that changes everything. Because it means the cycle is real. The pattern holds. And we're living inside it right now. Approaching the end of another age. And the question is whether we'll recognize what's coming. Whether we'll be ready. Whether anyone will survive to teach the next generation. And we're about to find out what the science says. So stay with me. Because this is where it gets real. Chapter 4: Genesis versus Science. You're in a laboratory, somewhere sterile and white, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and you're looking at a computer screen showing a genetic tree. A visualization of human mitochondrial DNA spreading out like roots or branches depending on how you look at it, and this DNA, passed from mother to child unchanged except for tiny mutations that accumulate predictably over time, can be used like a clock, counting backwards through generations, tracing lineages, finding common ancestors, and what the screen shows is strange, unsettling if you think about it too long, Because all human mitochondrial DNA, all of it, from every population on Earth, from the Inuit in Alaska to the Aboriginal Australians to the tribes of the Amazon to the people of Manhattan, it all traces back to a small group of women who lived between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago, and geneticists call this population mitochondrial Eve. Not because there was literally one woman, but because the genetic diversity we see today suggests a severe population bottleneck. A moment when humanity nearly went extinct. When the number of breeding individuals dropped to maybe 10,000, maybe fewer, and after that bottleneck the population exploded, spread across the world, diversified into the races and cultures and nations we see today. And you're staring at that tree on the screen, at the way the branches split and spread and multiply, and you're thinking about Genesis, about the flood, about Noah and his wife and his 3 sons Shem and Ham and Japheth and their wives, 8 people total, and you're thinking about the lifespans recorded in the Bible, the claim that people before and after the flood lived for hundreds of years, that Noah himself lived 950 years, that Methuselah lived 969. And you're asking yourself whether it's possible, whether the genetic data could actually support this, whether science without meaning to, without wanting to, has confirmed what the Bible has been saying for 3,000 years. And the answer is complicated, because the major bottleneck the geneticists see is ancient, deep in prehistory, much older than the biblical flood, but there's another pattern, a more recent one, that shows up in multiple populations. A reduction in diversity around 10 to 12,000 years ago, right around the end of the Younger Dryas period, right when the ice melted and sea levels rose and entire coastlines vanished underwater, right when every ancient culture places their flood myths. And if you're looking for evidence of a global catastrophe that killed most of humanity and left only a remnant to rebuild, that's when it happened. And the genetic data shows that after this event something changed. Populations that had been isolated for thousands of years suddenly started mixing. Technologies that had been localized suddenly started spreading. New haplogroups appeared and expanded rapidly from specific centers. The Fertile Crescent, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River, and it's almost like someone hit reset. Not completely, but enough to scramble the picture. Enough to create the conditions for what came next, for civilization to emerge simultaneously in multiple locations within a few centuries of each other. And you lean back from the screen, rubbing your eyes, and you ask yourself the question that geneticists avoid asking in public: if the Bible says people lived longer before and after the flood, if it describes a world where human lifespans gradually decreased from centuries to decades over just a few generations, could there be any biological truth to that? And surprisingly, disturbingly, there might be. The scientific consensus is clear, unambiguous, stated with confidence in every textbook and peer-reviewed paper. The lifespans recorded in Genesis are mythological, symbolic, allegorical, not literal. No human being lives for 900 years. It's biologically impossible. Human cells have built-in limitations. Telomeres shorten with each division. DNA accumulates damage from radiation and oxidative stress. Organs wear out. The immune system weakens. And even with modern medicine, with all our drugs and surgeries and interventions, the upper limit seems to be around 120 years. Maybe 130 in exceptional cases. So when Genesis says that Adam lived 930 years, that Methuselah lived 969, that Noah lived 950, scholars treat these numbers as exaggerations, or as a different way of counting time. Maybe they counted lunar months instead of solar years, which would reduce the numbers by a factor of 12. Or maybe the numbers are symbolic, representing spiritual maturity or tribal longevity or dynastic periods where a single name represents multiple generations. And for most people, for most of history, that explanation has been sufficient. It's mythology. It's ancient literature. It's not meant to be taken literally. It's teaching moral lessons and theological principles, not recording actual chronological data. But then you look at the pattern more carefully, and it's not random. The lifespans in Genesis decrease consistently, generation by generation, predictably. From Adam to Noah they're in the 900s. From Noah to Abraham they drop steadily through the 800s, 700s, 600s, down to the 400s, then the 200s, and by the time you get to Moses, they're down to 120, and if you plot it on a graph, it's a decay curve, exponential decay, like something is degrading, like the human organism is losing something generation by generation. And decay curves don't appear in mythology. Myths aren't mathematical. They don't follow statistical patterns. Myths have symbolic logic, narrative logic, but not the logic of data, and this looks like data, like someone was recording something real and didn't understand what they were measuring. They just knew that people used to live longer and now they don't. And they wrote down the numbers because the numbers mattered. And then you look at what else Genesis says about the pre-flood world. And it describes environmental conditions that were different. It says there was no rain before the flood, that a mist came up from the ground, that there was a firmament, a canopy of some kind separating the waters above from the waters below. And after the flood everything changed. The canopy collapsed. Rain became normal. The atmosphere was different. The environment was harsher. And some researchers, people outside mainstream academia, because you can't publish this in mainstream journals, they've proposed that this describes a real environmental shift. That before the flood the Earth had different atmospheric conditions, higher pressure maybe, more oxygen, less cosmic radiation, some kind of protective layer that made the environment more favorable to life, to longevity, and that these conditions could have supported longer lifespans. And while mainstream science rejects this completely, refuses to even consider it, there's some interesting experimental data. The genetic data shows bottlenecks, multiple bottlenecks actually, moments when human population crashed dramatically, and the most famous one is the Toba catastrophe, around 70,000 years ago, when a supervolcano in Indonesia erupted and nearly wiped out humanity, reducing the global population to maybe 10,000 individuals, maybe fewer, and after Toba the population rebounded slowly. And the genetic diversity we see today is much lower than it should be for a species that's been around for 200,000 years. And that tells you that humanity has nearly gone extinct multiple times. That we've had close calls. That we've clawed our way back from the edge more than once. And the biblical flood, if it happened around 12,000 years ago at the end of the Younger Dryas, would have been another bottleneck. Not as severe as Toba maybe, but significant enough to leave a mark in the genetic record. And there is a mark. There's archaeological evidence of massive climate disruption at the end of the Younger Dryas, rapid warming, melting glaciers, rising sea levels, catastrophic flooding, and there's a layer of sediment across North America called the black mat, a layer that contains high concentrations of iridium and nanodiamonds and spherules, signatures of impact, suggesting that a comet or asteroid struck the ice sheet covering North America, causing instant melting, triggering floods and tsunamis and the extinction of megafauna. Mammoths and saber-toothed cats and giant ground sloths all vanished within a few hundred years, And at the same time there's evidence of massive wildfires. The black mat contains charcoal and soot. And there's a population crash visible in the archaeological record. Human settlements abandoned. A gap in the cultural sequence. And then after the gap, within a few centuries, agriculture appears. Animal domestication appears. Pottery appears. Permanent settlements appear. And civilization begins, simultaneously in multiple locations. The Fertile Crescent and Egypt and the Indus Valley and China and Peru, all within 1,000 years of each other, which is impossibly fast if each of these civilizations developed independently, but it makes perfect sense if they all received knowledge from the same source, from survivors who had preserved the wisdom of the pre-catastrophe world, from teachers who spread out across the globe after the waters receded. Now here's where it gets really interesting, where the genetic data starts to line up with the ancient texts in ways that should make everyone pay attention. Around 10,000 years ago there's a sudden expansion of Y chromosome haplogroups, genetic lineages spreading rapidly from specific regions. Haplogroup J spreading from the Near East. Haplogroup R spreading from the Eurasian steppes. Haplogroup O spreading from East Asia. And if you map these expansions, they correspond to the regions where civilization first appears, where agriculture develops, where the great rivers host the first cities. The Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River. And it's almost like the survivors concentrated in certain areas after the catastrophe. Areas that were habitable, that had resources, that were suitable for rebuilding. And from those centers the knowledge spread, carried by people who had been taught, who knew things that the other survivors didn't. And over generations their descendants spread out, carrying their genes and their knowledge with them. And this is exactly what you'd expect if the flood happened and a small group survived and were taught how to rebuild by beings who had preserved the pre-flood wisdom and the lifespans. If Genesis is recording something real, even if the numbers are somewhat exaggerated, would explain why civilization developed so quickly. Because if the patriarchs really lived for hundreds of years, even if it's 300 instead of 900, they would have been able to teach multiple generations, to ensure the knowledge was passed on accurately, to maintain continuity between the old world and the new. And maybe that's the real purpose of the long lifespans, not to impress us with how righteous they were, but to show us how the knowledge survived, how the bridge worked, how human civilization was able to recover from a near-extinction event and rebuild within just a few centuries. In the 1,990 seconds, a team of geneticists led by Spencer Wells began the Genographic Project, an ambitious effort to trace human migration patterns by collecting DNA samples from indigenous populations all over the world, and analyzing the mutations that had accumulated over thousands of years. And what they found was revolutionary. They found that all non-African humans, everyone whose ancestors left Africa, share a common ancestor who lived around 70,000 years ago, right around the time of the Toba catastrophe. And this ancestor was part of a tiny population, possibly as few as a few hundred individuals who left Africa and somehow survived when most of humanity didn't. And from this bottleneck, from this handful of people, all the diversity of Europeans and Asians and Native Americans and Pacific Islanders emerged. Every population outside Africa traces back to this one small group. And the data also showed something else. Around 12,000 years ago there was another shift. Populations that had been isolated started mixing. New haplogroups appeared and spread rapidly. And the genetic signature of agriculture began. People who had been eating wild plants suddenly showed signs of eating domesticated grains. Their teeth changed. Their bones changed. Their gut bacteria evolved to process different foods. And it happened fast, too fast for natural evolution, almost like someone taught them, showed them which plants to cultivate, how to select seeds, how to irrigate fields, and wells in his book. The Journey of Man notes that this timing coincides with the end of the Ice Age, with massive climate change, with the flooding of coastlines, and with the myths. He doesn't say the flood was real. He's too careful for that, too aware of his academic reputation. But he acknowledges that something happened. Something global. Something that changed the trajectory of human history, that created the conditions for civilization. And when you read Genesis alongside this genetic data, when you compare the biblical genealogies with the Y chromosome haplogroup tree, the parallels are striking. Genesis says that after the flood, Noah's 3 sons Shem and Ham and Japheth spread out and repopulated the earth, and their descendants became the nations. And if you map the genetic data, it follows a similar pattern. The major haplogroups diverge around 10 to 12,000 years ago and spread to different regions. And it's like the genetic tree is giving you a map that matches the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10. Not perfectly, not precisely, but close enough to make you stop and think. Maybe the lifespans in Genesis aren't meant to be taken exactly literally. Maybe 900 years is symbolic of something, a way of expressing a truth that didn't have precise words. But even if the numbers are exaggerated, even if they're metaphorical, they're telling you something important. They're saying that the people who survived the flood, who rebuilt civilization, who bridged the old world and the new, were fundamentally different from us. They had something we don't have. Whether it's longevity or knowledge or a connection to what came before, they were special, chosen, preserved for a purpose. And they used whatever advantage they had to ensure that humanity didn't fall back into complete ignorance. That the knowledge was transmitted. That civilization recovered. And the genetic data supports this. Not the specific numbers maybe, but the general pattern. There was a catastrophe. There was a bottleneck. There was a small surviving population. And from that population everything we see today emerged. All human diversity. All civilization. All the accumulated knowledge and achievement of our species flows from that tiny remnant. And if that's true, if we really did almost go extinct 12,000 years ago, if we really were reduced to a few thousand individuals scattered across a devastated planet, then the flood wasn't mythology. It was history. It was the defining event of human existence. It was the moment when everything changed, when the old world ended and the new one began, and the survivors, whoever they were, whatever they knew, they shaped everything that came after. They determined what knowledge would be preserved, what technologies would be recovered, which bloodlines would rule, which secrets would be guarded. And maybe that's why the genetic data matters. Not because it proves every detail of Genesis, but because it confirms the essential truth. There was a catastrophe. There were survivors. And we are their descendants, carrying their genes, living in the world they rebuilt, following patterns they established. And the question that should haunt you is whether we're prepared for the next catastrophe, whether we've learned anything, whether anyone will survive to teach the next generation, or whether the cycle will repeat and most of what we've achieved will be lost again. The genetic evidence is compelling, but it's not the only evidence. It's not even the strangest evidence. Because while you can argue about DNA and population models and whether bottlenecks prove anything definitive, there's one category of evidence that's harder to dismiss, and that's the physical structures, the monuments, the engineering achievements that exist right now, that you can visit and measure and analyze. Things that shouldn't be possible with the technology supposedly available. And we've touched on some of this already, the drill cores and the precision stone work, but we haven't gone deep enough. We haven't looked at the most controversial sites. The ones that make archaeologists uncomfortable. That don't fit any timeline. That suggest capabilities far beyond what we think ancient people should have had. Places like Pumapunku in Bolivia where 100-ton blocks are cut with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, or the submerged structures off the coast of Japan that might predate the flood, or the megalithic walls in Peru that are built from stones so massive and so precisely fitted that earthquakes can't shake them apart. And all of this exists. It's real. It's measurable. And it requires explanation. And the standard explanations don't work. They don't account for the precision or the scale or the sophistication. And that's where we're going next. Into the physical evidence that mainstream archaeology tries to ignore. The structures that prove the post-flood world was rebuilt with knowledge and technology that shouldn't have existed. And once you see this evidence, once you understand what it implies, you'll never look at ancient history the same way again. Chapter 5. Controversial evidence. You're standing on a windswept hill in southeastern Turkey, a place called Göbekli Tepe, which means Potbelly Hill in Turkish, and you're looking at something that shouldn't exist. Massive stone pillars arranged in circles. T-shaped megaliths carved from limestone. Some of them weighing 16 tons. And they're decorated, covered with reliefs of animals. Foxes and boars and lions and scorpions and vultures. Carved with skill and artistry. With attention to detail. And these pillars aren't isolated. There are multiple circles. Multiple enclosures. And the whole complex covers more than 20 acres. And here's what breaks the timeline. What makes every archaeologist who sees this place uncomfortable even if they won't admit it publicly? This site is old, radiocarbon dated to around 9,600 BC, which makes it older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years, older than the invention of agriculture, older than pottery, older than metal tools, older than any civilization that conventional archaeology recognizes, and the people who built this, according to everything we've been taught, should have been hunter-gatherers, nomadic bands, following game and gathering wild plants, people without permanent settlements, without social hierarchy, without the organizational capacity to quarry and transport and erect 16-ton pillars, without the surplus food necessary to support specialized laborers, without writing to record plans or coordinate work. And yet here it is, undeniable, sophisticated, planned, executed with precision, and whoever made this didn't just stumble upon the idea, they knew what they were doing. They had a vision, they had knowledge, and then, here's the part that should make you stop and think, after they built it, after perhaps centuries of use, they buried it, deliberately, carefully. They filled in the enclosures with earth and rubble, covered the pillars, preserved them underground, and then they left, and the site sat there hidden for 11,000 years until a Kurdish shepherd noticed some carved stones sticking out of the ground in 1994, and archaeologists started digging. And what they found has been quietly, methodically undermining everything we thought we knew about the development of human civilization, because Göbekli Tepe proves that monumental architecture came before agriculture, that religion or astronomy or whatever this place was for came before settled life, that complex organization and advanced knowledge existed at the very beginning of the Holocene, right after the Ice Age ended, right when the flood myths place the Great Catastrophe. And you walk around these circles, running your hand over the ancient carvings, feeling the limestone warm from the sun. And you realize you're not looking at the beginning of civilization. You're looking at something that survived the end of the previous one. And the people who built this were trying to preserve knowledge, trying to mark this location, trying to leave a message for whoever came after, and then they buried it to protect it. And the question that follows you away from this place, that stays with you long after you've left, is what were they trying to preserve? What did they know? And why did they think it needed to be hidden underground for 11,000 years? The mainstream explanation for Göbekli Tepe, the official narrative that dominates museum exhibits and academic papers, is that it represents a transition point, a moment when hunter-gatherers were beginning to settle down, when they were experimenting with collective labor, when religion was emerging as an organizing force that could motivate people to undertake massive projects, and the temple complex, according to this view, was built by multiple groups coming together seasonally, perhaps for rituals, perhaps for astronomical observations, perhaps for gatherings where different bands would meet and trade and arrange marriages. And over time, as their society became more complex, as they developed agriculture and pottery and permanent settlements, they moved on. They abandoned the site. And it was deliberately buried either because it lost its religious significance or because it was ritually closed, a way of marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. And for many archaeologists this explanation is sufficient. Göbekli Tepe is impressive, yes. It's earlier than expected, yes. It pushes back the timeline, yes. But it doesn't break the model. It just requires some adjustment. Humans are capable of amazing things, even without writing or metal or domesticated animals. The capacity for complex thought and organization has always been there. We just didn't have evidence of it being expressed this early. And the fact that we're surprised says more about our assumptions than about their capabilities. And this is the standard academic position. Cautious, conservative, unwilling to speculate beyond what the evidence strictly demands, unwilling to consider possibilities that would require fundamental revision of the historical narrative. And for most people who read about Göbekli Tepe in National Geographic or watch documentaries about it, this explanation is enough. It's interesting, it's surprising. But it doesn't challenge anything fundamental. It's just an earlier example of something we already knew humans could do. But when you actually visit Göbekli Tepe, when you see the scale and the precision and the planning that went into it, when you understand what it would take to organize and execute a project like this, the standard explanation starts to feel inadequate, starts to feel like avoidance, because this isn't a crude first attempt at monumental architecture. This isn't people fumbling towards something new. This is mature work, sophisticated work, the product of people who knew what they were doing, who had done it before or who had been taught by someone who had. The pillars are precisely shaped. The T-form isn't random. It appears consistently across multiple enclosures, suggesting standardization, suggesting planning, suggesting some kind of blueprint or template. And the carvings aren't primitive stick figures. They're detailed, realistic, showing knowledge of animal anatomy, showing artistic skill that takes years to develop. And the astronomical alignments are deliberate. Specific pillars aligned to specific stars at specific dates. And all of this requires knowledge, requires organization, requires a level of social complexity that shouldn't exist among hunter-gatherers who are supposedly just figuring out how to plant seeds. And then there's the deliberate burial, which is the detail that nobody can adequately explain. Why would you spend decades, maybe generations, building something this massive, this important, this aligned to the cosmos, and then bury it? Why not just abandon it? Why go through the enormous effort of filling in the enclosures with thousands of tons of earth and rubble unless you were trying to preserve it? Unless you knew something was coming. Unless you were hiding it, protecting it, leaving it for someone in the future to find. Let me tell you what they don't want you to consider. What gets dismissed as fringe speculation but actually makes more sense than the official story. Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors of the pre-flood world, by people who had knowledge from before the catastrophe, who understood astronomy and architecture and symbolic representation, who knew the ice age was ending, who could read the signs, the changing climate, the melting glaciers, the rising waters, and they built this complex as a time capsule, as an astronomical observatory, as a warning system, encoding knowledge in stone because they knew writing might not survive, knew that whatever catastrophe was coming would destroy most of what existed, and they aligned the pillars to specific stars because those stars would tell future generations when the cycle would complete, when it would happen again, and then when the catastrophe came, when the Younger Dryas ended abruptly and the world was reshaped by floods and fires and climate chaos, the survivors buried it, preserved it, marked the location, and moved on to other regions where they could survive, where they could rebuild, and they became the teachers, the gods, the civilizers of the post-flood world, spreading out to Sumer and Egypt and the Indus Valley, carrying knowledge from Göbekli Tepe, from the old world, and that's why civilization appears so suddenly in these places. That's why the knowledge seems to come from nowhere, because it came from survivors who had preserved it through the catastrophe. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone, that's what makes this even more disturbing. Nearby there's Karahan Tepe, just as old, just as elaborate, with underground chambers and carved pillars and astronomical alignments, and excavations are revealing more sites, a whole network of megalithic complexes in southeastern Turkey, all dating to the same period, all built with the same level of sophistication, all deliberately buried and preserved. And when you zoom out, when you look globally, you find the same pattern. Poverty Point in Louisiana, earthworks dated to around 1700 BC but possibly older, aligned to celestial events. Nabta Playa in Egypt, a stone circle older than Stonehenge aligned to the summer solstice and to specific stars. Watson Break in Louisiana, the oldest known mound complex in North America, dated to 3500 BC. All of these sites showing knowledge of astronomy, all of them involving massive labor, all of them appearing earlier than they should. And the question nobody wants to ask officially is whether these are connected, whether they're part of the same knowledge system, whether they were all built by people who had inherited wisdom from before the flood, from the civilization that drowned, and if so, what else did they know, what else did they build? What else did they preserve? In 1985, a Japanese marine geologist named Masaaki Kimura was diving off the coast of Yonaguni Island, the westernmost island of Japan, and he discovered something underwater that shouldn't be there. Massive stone structures, terraces and platforms and steps and walls, carved angles and straight edges, and the structures are huge. The main platform is about 150 feet long and 60 feet wide, with multiple levels. And Kimura spent years studying these structures, measuring them, mapping them, analyzing the tool marks, and he became convinced they were artificial, man-made, carved from the bedrock. And if they're artificial, then they're ancient. Because sea level rise after the last ice age means these structures were above water until around 10,000 years ago, which would make them older than the pyramids, older than Sumer, older than any civilization we recognize, and mainstream archaeology has fought this conclusion fiercely. They insist the Yonaguni structures are natural formations, weathered bedrock, coincidental patterns that look artificial but aren't. And maybe they're right, maybe it is natural, but Kimura found tool marks, right angles that don't occur naturally, post holes for what might have been wooden structures, and if he's right, if Yonaguni is artificial, then someone built a complex there before the flood, before the waters rose. And that means there was a maritime civilization in the Pacific 10,000 years ago or more, a civilization sophisticated enough to quarry and shape stone on a massive scale. And where did they go when the waters rose? Where did they take their knowledge? And could they be the teachers that appeared in Sumer and Egypt and South America after the flood? The gods who came from the sea. Maybe the most controversial evidence is controversial not because it's weak or poorly documented, but because it's too strong, because it forces us to reconsider everything. To admit that human history isn't a simple progression from primitive to advanced, that there have been rises and falls, civilizations that knew things we're only now rediscovering, cultures that achieved heights we haven't yet matched. And that's uncomfortable. It threatens our sense of progress, our belief that we're special, that we're the pinnacle of human development. It suggests that we might be inferior in some ways to people who lived thousands of years ago. And that's a bitter pill to swallow. But the structures don't lie. The precision doesn't lie. The astronomical alignments and the mathematical relationships encoded in stone, these aren't metaphors, they're measurable, they're real, they require explanation. And if we're honest, if we set aside our pride and our assumptions and our need to believe that history moves in a straight line from ignorance to enlightenment, we have to admit that something happened, something global, something catastrophic, that destroyed a civilization and left survivors who had knowledge, who had techniques, who had understanding of astronomy and mathematics and engineering that they passed on to the post-flood world. And those survivors, those teachers, they did their best to preserve what they could. They built structures that would last. They encoded knowledge in stone and in calendar systems and in myths and legends. They established priesthoods and schools and secret societies to guard the wisdom, and for a while it worked. For a few thousand years civilization flourished, knowledge expanded, but then something happened. The knowledge started to fade, the techniques were lost, the priesthoods became corrupt or were destroyed, the libraries burned, and we entered the Dark Ages, and we've been climbing back ever since. Slowly, painfully, rediscovering things that were once known, reinventing tools that once existed, and maybe we're close now. Maybe we're approaching the level that the pre-flood civilization achieved. Or maybe we're about to fall again. Maybe the cycle is turning. Maybe the next catastrophe is approaching. And the question is whether we'll be ready, whether we'll preserve the knowledge, whether anyone will survive to teach the next generation. You've seen the structures now. The impossible monuments. The precision megalithic work. The sites that don't fit any timeline. And you've seen how mainstream archaeology explains them away or ignores them or dismisses them as anomalies. And maybe you're starting to understand why. Because if Göbekli Tepe and Yonaguni and all the other controversial sites are real, if they're evidence of pre-flood civilization, then everything we've been taught about human history is wrong. The whole narrative collapses. The progression from Stone Age to Bronze Age to Iron Age. The idea that civilization began in Sumer 5,000 years ago. The belief that we're the most advanced humans who have ever lived. All of it becomes questionable, and that's threatening, that's uncomfortable. That's the kind of realization that can shake your entire worldview. But here's the thing, we're not done yet. We haven't looked at all the evidence, there's more. There are theories about who these teachers really were, where they came from, what they wanted, whether they were human survivors or something else. Whether they came from a lost continent or from beneath the sea or from somewhere even stranger. And these theories range from plausible to wild to completely insane, but they all attempt to explain the same pattern. The sudden appearance of knowledge after catastrophe. The teacher figures. The bloodlines. The structures that shouldn't exist. And we're going to examine these theories. not to endorse any particular one but to show you the full spectrum of explanations, to let you see what people are thinking, what researchers are proposing, and then you can decide for yourself what makes sense, what fits the evidence, what explains the mystery. Chapter 6, Modern Theory. You're sitting in a dim room, and there are 3 people with you, each representing a different explanation for the same mystery. The same pattern we've been tracing through 12 episodes now. The catastrophe, the survivors, the teachers, the sudden appearance of advanced civilization. And these 3 people, they disagree on almost everything except the basic facts. The first is an archaeologist, cautious, trained in the academic method, holding a folder full of peer-reviewed papers. And she says, the survivors were human, just like us. They carried the memory of a lost civilization, the knowledge of the pre-flood world, and they did their best to rebuild, to teach the next generation, to preserve what could be preserved. They weren't supernatural, they weren't gods, they were extraordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and that's enough to explain everything we've seen. The second person is older, a scholar of ancient texts, someone who's spent decades reading Enoch and Jubilees and the Sumerian tablets and the Egyptian funerary literature, and he says, the Watchers returned, the same beings who fell before the flood, who taught forbidden knowledge, who bred with human women and created the Nephilim. They survived the catastrophe in some form, perhaps as discarnate entities, perhaps in hidden enclaves, perhaps in dimensions we don't understand. And after the flood they came back in the guise of gods. And they taught because they needed humanity for something. Because we serve a purpose in their agenda, whatever that agenda is. And the third person is younger, intense, holding a tablet showing satellite images and geometric calculations. And he says, they came from outside, the Anunnaki, the star people, extraterrestrial beings who have been involved with humanity for hundreds of thousands of years, who genetically engineered us, who use us as a workforce or an experiment or something else entirely. And the flood wasn't divine judgment, it was a natural catastrophe that they knew was coming, and they chose not to warn most of humanity. They let it happen, but a few of them, out of compassion or self-interest or ancient agreements, warned certain humans, helped them survive, and after the waters receded they returned and resumed their management of our species. And you sit there listening to them argue, watching them present evidence, statistics, translations, astronomical data, genetic studies, and you realize that none of them can prove their case definitively, but each one explains certain things, each one accounts for parts of the pattern, and maybe the truth isn't one or the other. Maybe it's all 3 combined, maybe it's none of them, maybe it's something stranger that we haven't imagined yet, and your job as someone trying to understand, as someone who's followed this investigation through 11 episodes and now this one, isn't to pick a side and defend it. Your job is to look at what each theory explains, what it fails to explain, what assumptions it makes, what evidence it uses, and to stay open to the possibility that the answer is more complex, more layered, more uncomfortable than any single narrative can capture. Because maybe that's the real secret. Maybe the reason these mysteries persist is that they're designed to resist simple explanations. Designed to keep us searching. Designed to force us to think harder and look deeper and question more. The first hypothesis, the one that most archaeologists would accept if pushed, the one that stays within the boundaries of materialist science, is that the post-flood world was rebuilt by human survivors of a pre-flood civilization, that somewhere, in isolated pockets, on high ground or islands or in mountain valleys, groups of people weathered the catastrophe, and they carried with them the knowledge of the old world, Not all of it obviously, much was lost, but enough. Enough to remember astronomy and mathematics and architecture, enough to understand agriculture and metallurgy and writing systems. And when the waters receded, when the climate stabilized, when the coastlines stopped shifting and the ice stopped melting, these survivors came down from their refuges. They found other survivors who had lost everything, who were living like our Paleolithic ancestors, hunting and gathering and struggling to survive. And the knowledge keepers taught them, organized them, gave them the tools to rebuild. And over a few generations, within perhaps 500 to 1,000 years, civilization emerged in multiple locations: Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley and China and Peru, and the similarities between these civilizations, the shared symbols and myths and architectural principles. These aren't evidence of supernatural intervention or alien contact. They're evidence of diffusion, of knowledge spreading from a common source. From the survivors who became the teachers, who became mythologized as gods because what they knew seemed magical to people who had lost everything. And this theory has appeal because it doesn't require anything beyond human capability. It doesn't invoke angels or aliens. It just requires that we accept that there was a sophisticated civilization before the flood, a civilization that the mainstream academy refuses to acknowledge because there's no smoking gun, no intact city, no library full of texts. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Especially when you're talking about a catastrophe that raised sea levels by 400 feet and drowned every coastline where humans would naturally have lived, where the evidence would be. And this human survivor theory explains the pattern. The teacher figures. The sudden appearance of advanced knowledge. It explains why the myths are so similar across cultures. It explains the astronomical alignments and the mathematical relationships encoded in ancient structures. It explains everything without requiring supernatural intervention, and for many people that's preferable. That's more comfortable. That's easier to accept than the alternatives. The second hypothesis is more controversial, more theological, rooted in the texts we've been examining throughout this series: the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi texts, and it proposes that the Watchers, the angels who fell before the flood, who taught humanity forbidden knowledge, who bred with human women and created the Nephilim, that they survived, not physically because the flood killed their hybrid offspring and perhaps killed some of them as well, but they survived in some other form, as spirits, as discarnate entities, as beings existing in a dimension adjacent to ours. And after the flood they returned. They took on the role of gods. They appeared to the survivors as divine beings, as teachers, as civilizers, and they resumed their instruction, but this time under supervision, under restrictions imposed by the Most High. They were permitted to teach certain things but not others. Permitted to guide but not to interbreed. Permitted to influence but not to control directly. And the reason they did this, according to this theory, is that they need humanity for something. The texts aren't entirely clear on what, maybe as worshippers because worship generates some kind of energy or attention that these beings require. Maybe as a workforce because they need physical labor in the material realm and they can't or won't do it themselves. Maybe as a genetic experiment because they're trying to create something. A hybrid species. A bridge between matter and spirit. Or maybe for reasons we can't comprehend because we don't understand their nature or their goals or their relationship to the divine hierarchy that governs the cosmos. And if you read the ancient texts with this lens, suddenly many things make sense. The emphasis on sacrifice in every ancient religion. The detailed instructions for worship, for ritual purity, for offerings and prayers and ceremonies, This isn't just humans making up religion to explain natural phenomena. This is humans responding to actual demands from actual beings who require these things, who feed on them somehow, who use them for purposes we don't fully understand, and the anger of the gods when humans fail to comply, when they worship other gods or when they neglect the rituals or when they rebel. This isn't metaphor. This is description of actual relationships between humans and non-human entities who have power and who use that power to enforce obedience. Now take a breath and consider what this means if it's true. Because this is the hypothesis that makes religious people uncomfortable and atheists dismissive. But it actually fits the evidence better than the materialist explanation in some ways. It explains the structures we've been examining, the pyramids and the ziggurats and the megalithic temples. Maybe they weren't just religious sites. Maybe they were functional. Maybe they served purposes we don't understand: energy generation, dimensional portals, communication devices, antennae for receiving or transmitting something. And the Watchers, or whatever you want to call these beings, they knew how to use these structures. They understood principles of physics or metaphysics that we've lost or never had, and they taught humans just enough to build the structures but not enough to understand them, not enough to use them independently. And this explains why the knowledge was lost. Why after a few thousand years humanity entered the Dark Ages and forgot how to build arches and aqueducts. Because when the Watchers withdrew, or were forced to withdraw, or were bound again in whatever valleys or dimensions or prisons hold them, the humans were left with structures they couldn't replicate and texts they couldn't fully understand and rituals that became cargo cults. Empty repetitions without comprehension. And it also explains the bloodlines, the families chosen to receive deeper knowledge, the priest kings and pharaohs and emperors who claimed divine descent. Maybe they weren't lying. Maybe they really were different. Maybe they had Watcher genetics, remnant Nephilim DNA, enough to make them taller or stronger or longer lived or more intelligent, enough to justify their rule. And maybe those bloodlines still exist, still intermarry, still guard the knowledge, still wait for the return of the Watchers who made them what they are. The third hypothesis is the one that makes academics most uncomfortable, the one that gets you labeled a crank or a pseudoscientist or worse, and it's the ancient astronaut theory, popularized by Erich von Däniken in Chariots of the Gods, expanded by Zecharia Sitchin with his translations of Sumerian texts, and it proposes that the teachers, the gods, the civilizers of the post-flood world, were extraterrestrial beings, the Anunnaki in Sumerian terminology, who came to Earth, long before the flood, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And they genetically engineered modern humans from earlier hominids, Homo erectus or Neanderthals or something else, using their own DNA, to create a species intelligent enough to follow complex instructions but not so intelligent that they'd rebel, a worker race. And they used us to mine gold or build structures or perform tasks they needed done on Earth for reasons the theory doesn't fully explain. Maybe the gold was needed for their atmosphere. Maybe Earth was a colony. Maybe we were an experiment. And the flood, in this version, wasn't divine judgment. It was a natural catastrophe, the end of the Ice Age, rising sea levels, climate chaos. Something the Anunnaki knew was coming. Possibly something they could have prevented or mitigated but chose not to. They made a decision to let it happen. To let most of humanity die. To reset the experiment. But a few of them, out of compassion or personal attachment or political disagreement with the decision, warned certain humans, Noah, Zeushudra, Atrahasis, help them build boats, help them survive. And after the flood these same Anunnaki or their representatives returned and resumed control, resumed their management of humanity, And the civilizations that emerged were designed, planned, organized, according to an agenda that served Anunnaki interests, and the structures, the impossible precision megalithic construction. This wasn't done by humans with copper tools. This was done with technology, advanced technology that the Anunnaki possessed, laser cutters or sonic devices or anti-gravity systems. Things that sound like science fiction but might be science fact for a civilization, thousands or millions of years more advanced than us, and when they left, when their mission was complete or when they were recalled or when they decided Earth wasn't worth the effort anymore, they took their technology with them, destroyed it, hid it, left us with monuments we can't explain and myths we dismiss as primitive superstition. 3 theories. 3 radically different explanations. And the honest answer is we don't know which one is true. Maybe none of them. Maybe all of them contain pieces of truth. Maybe the reality is stranger than anything we've proposed. But what matters isn't picking the right answer. What matters is understanding that the question is real, the pattern is real, the evidence is real, there was a catastrophe, there were survivors, there were teachers, civilization did emerge suddenly in multiple locations with knowledge that shouldn't have existed. And that pattern demands explanation. And the mainstream narrative, the one that says everything developed slowly and naturally from primitive origins, that narrative doesn't fit. It doesn't account for the precision or the scale or the speed or the global distribution. It requires too many coincidences, too much independent invention, too much parallel development. And at some point you have to ask whether it's more reasonable to believe in coincidence or to believe in connection, in diffusion, in teaching, in knowledge that survived from before. And if you accept that there was teaching, that there were teachers, then you have to ask who they were, and each of these 3 theories gives an answer: human survivors, watchers, Anunnaki. And each answer has implications. Profound implications for how we understand ourselves, our history, our purpose, our future. If the teachers were human, then we're capable of rising and falling, of building and losing. And that means our current civilization isn't permanent. It could fall just as the pre-flood civilization fell. If the teachers were watchers, then we're not alone, we're not in control. We're part of a cosmic drama that we barely understand. Pawns in a game between spiritual forces. And our choices matter, but maybe not in the ways we think. And if the teachers were Anunnaki, then we're not even a natural species. We're created. We're property. We're being managed. And everything we think we know about our origins and our destiny is filtered through the lens of our creators, who might not have our best interests at heart. And maybe that's why these questions matter so much, not because we need the right answer, but because asking the question changes how we see ourselves. And once you've seen the pattern, once you understand that human history is stranger and deeper and more mysterious than you were taught, you can't go back to the comfortable narratives. You have to live with uncertainty, with possibility, with the knowledge that we might be much less in control than we think. So which is it? Human survivors carrying knowledge from a lost civilization, fallen angels, continuing their ancient agenda, or extraterrestrial beings managing their genetic experiment? Or is it something else entirely, something we haven't even considered? And does it matter? Does knowing the truth change anything? Or is the mystery itself the point? The reminder that we don't have all the answers. That history is deeper than we know. That the universe is stranger than we imagine. And if you're still here, if you've followed this investigation through 12 episodes of evidence and questions and uncomfortable implications, then you know it matters. You know that understanding the past shapes how we think about the present and prepare for the future. Because if the pattern is real, if civilization rises and falls in cycles, If catastrophes happen and survivors teach and knowledge is preserved by bloodlines and secret societies, then we're not at the end of history, we're somewhere in the middle, and the cycle is still turning. And the question isn't whether there will be another catastrophe. The question is when, and whether we'll be ready, whether we'll recognize the signs, whether we'll preserve what matters, whether we'll be the teachers for the next age. And that brings us to the final question, the one that ties everything together, the one that's been lurking underneath every chapter of this investigation. If the teachers came once, if they appeared after the flood and taught and guided and then withdrew, then where did they go? Why did they leave? And more importantly, are they coming back? And if they are, will we recognize them? Will we welcome them? Will we trust them? Or will we resist? And that's where we're going now, into the final mystery, the question of return. The prophecies, the signs, the evidence that the cycle might be completing, that the age might be ending, that the teachers, whoever they are, might be preparing to return. You're standing at the edge of a chasm, and below you is darkness, deeper than you can measure, and across the chasm, on the other side, there's a light, faint, flickering like a candle in wind, and you know that the only way forward is to jump, to trust that there's something solid to land on, to believe that the journey doesn't end here at the edge. And the question that's been following you through 12 episodes, through floods and survivors and teachers and structures and theories, the question finally catches up. And it's not the one you expected. It's not did the flood happen or who were the teachers or what knowledge did they bring. Those questions have answers. Complicated answers. Uncertain answers. But answers nonetheless. The real question, the one that matters now, the one that should keep you awake tonight, is simpler and harder and more immediate. It's this. If they came back once, if the teachers appeared after the catastrophe and rebuilt civilization and established bloodlines and encoded knowledge in stone and calendar systems, then why did they leave? Why did they withdraw? Why did direct contact stop? And more importantly, are they coming back? Because every ancient tradition, every religious text, every prophecy, they all say the same thing at the end. They'll return, when the time is right, when humanity is ready, when the cycle completes, when the signs appear, they'll come back, the gods will descend, the watchers will be released, the Anunnaki will return, the kingdom will be established, the judgment will occur. Different words, different frameworks, different theological systems, but the same essential promise or threat depending on how you look at it. They left, but they're coming back, and you stand at the edge of this chasm, feeling the wind, hearing echoes from the darkness below, seeing that distant light flickering, and you realize this isn't ancient history. This isn't mythology. This isn't something that happened long ago and doesn't affect you. This is now. This is the question we're living inside. Are we still being watched? Are we still being guided? Are the bloodlines still in power? Are the secret societies still guarding the knowledge? Are the structures still functioning? Are the calendar systems still counting down? And if the flood was a reset, if it marked the end of one age and the beginning of another, then what happens when this age ends? What happens when the cycle turns again? When the catastrophe comes? When the teachers return? And are we the survivors this time? The ones who'll be chosen and taught and used to rebuild? Or are we the ones who'll be washed away? The ones who failed the test? The ones who didn't preserve what mattered? And how do we know? How do we tell? What are the signs? What should we be watching for? And most importantly, what should we do if we see them? The traditional religious answer, the one that's been preached from pulpits for 2,000 years, is that the gods withdrew because humanity had to grow up, had to learn to walk on our own, had to develop faith without evidence, had to choose righteousness without coercion. The age of miracles ended. The age of direct divine contact ceased. Because it needed to end. Because faith only means something when you can't see. When you have to trust without proof. When you have to choose good without knowing for certain that God is watching. And this withdrawal, this divine silence, it's temporary. It's a test. It's a period of spiritual maturation. And when it's over, when we've proven ourselves or when we've failed sufficiently or when the appointed time arrives, then God will return, Christ will come back, the kingdom will be established. There will be judgment and resurrection and a new heaven and a new earth. But when you step outside this framework, when you look at it from a distance with the evidence we've been examining, when you consider the possibility that the gods were teachers, survivors, watchers, or Anunnaki, then the withdrawal takes on a different character, becomes less comforting, more ambiguous. And there are other possibilities, darker possibilities, that the withdrawal wasn't voluntary, that something forced them to leave or to hide. The Book of Enoch describes a war in heaven, a rebellion put down violently, and the leaders were bound, imprisoned in the valleys of the earth, held there by angelic forces. And they'll remain imprisoned until the day of judgment, until the appointed time when they'll be released for a final confrontation. Or maybe the withdrawal was tactical, maybe they achieved what they wanted, set up the civilizations, established the bloodlines, encoded the knowledge, created the religions, and then they left because the system was self-sustaining. They could observe from a distance, intervene only when necessary. And if that's true, then they never really left. They're still here, hidden, watching, waiting. And here's the detail that should terrify you. The detail that explains everything but that nobody wants to talk about. The calendar systems we discussed earlier. The precessional cycle. The 26,000-year great year. We're approaching the end of an age right now. The age of Pisces is ending. The age of Aquarius is beginning. The precession is moving us from one zodiacal house to another. And every ancient tradition says that these transitions are dangerous, that they're marked by catastrophe, by upheaval, by the old order dying and the new order being born in violence and chaos. And the structures, the pyramids and the megalithic temples, they're not just monuments, they're clocks, they're warning systems, they're encoded messages, saying this is when it happens. This is the sign. This is the moment when the cycle completes and the teachers return and everything changes. And we're there now. We're at the transition. The signs are appearing. The climate is changing. The ice is melting again. Sea levels are rising. Political systems are failing. Religions are losing their grip. Technology is accelerating beyond our ability to control it. Artificial intelligence emerging. Genetic engineering advancing. Quantum computing breaking encryption. And maybe this is exactly what happened before the last catastrophe. Maybe this is how it starts. With humanity feeling powerful and advanced and in control, building towers that reach toward heaven, playing with technologies we don't fully understand, and the gods or teachers or watchers look down and say, they've gone too far again. Time to reset, time to flood, time to reduce them back to manageable numbers. And maybe the bloodlines know this. Maybe that's why they've been building bunkers and seed vaults and storing knowledge in digital formats and preparing for something. Because they've seen the signs, they've read the calendars, they know what's coming, they know the cycle is completing, and they're preparing to survive again, to be the bridge again, to preserve the knowledge again, And the question is whether they'll share it this time. Whether they'll teach everyone or just a chosen few. Whether the next age will be more free or more controlled. Whether we're approaching liberation or enslavement. In the 1940 seconds, cargo cults emerged in the South Pacific, among indigenous people in Melanesia who had been contacted by Allied forces during World War II. The soldiers arrived with planes and ships and radios and medicine and manufactured goods, things the islanders had never seen, technology that seemed magical, and the soldiers were treated as gods or spirits. And they brought cargo, wealth, abundance. And then the war ended and the soldiers left and the cargo stopped coming. And the islanders, trying to understand what had happened, trying to bring the cargo back, trying to restore contact with the powerful beings who had come and gone. They created rituals. They built mock airstrips out of bamboo. They carved wooden radios and headphones. They made straw airplanes. They dressed in military uniforms made from local materials. And they performed ceremonies, reenacting what they'd seen the soldiers do, hoping that if they got the ritual right, if they mimicked the behavior precisely enough, the cargo would return, the planes would come back, the gods would descend again. And anthropologists studying these cults, watching them form in real time, realized they were seeing the birth of religion, watching historical events transform into mythology, watching technology become magic, watching humans become gods in the memory of those who survived contact, and it made them ask uncomfortable questions. Is this what happened in the ancient world? Were the gods just advanced beings? Humans from a lost civilization or extraterrestrials or something else? Who came and helped and then left? And were they mythologized, deified, turned into supernatural beings because the people who remained couldn't explain them any other way, couldn't process what they'd seen except through religious categories? And if that's true, then the withdrawal of the gods is just the departure of the cargo planes, and religion is humanity's cargo cult, an attempt to bring them back, to summon the teachers, to restore contact with the source of knowledge and power and abundance. And maybe it will work, maybe the rituals matter, maybe the prayers reach somewhere. Or maybe we're just performing ceremonies in bamboo airstrips, waiting for planes that will never return. The question of why they left matters less than the question of whether we're ready if they return, because the pattern is clear. Catastrophe followed by intervention, followed by teaching, followed by civilization, followed by withdrawal, followed by gradual decline, followed by catastrophe again, and we're somewhere in that cycle right now. We've rebuilt, we've advanced. We've reached a level of technology that might even surpass what the pre-flood civilization achieved in some areas. We can split atoms and edit genes and communicate instantaneously across the globe and leave our planet and peer into the structure of matter and map the human genome. And if the cycle holds, if the pattern repeats, then we're approaching the next catastrophe, the next reset, whether it's climate change or nuclear war or asteroid impact or solar flare or something we haven't anticipated, something is coming. And the question is whether there will be survivors, whether there will be teachers, whether someone will preserve the knowledge, whether the bloodlines will fulfill their function, or whether this time it will be total, complete, final, whether this will be the catastrophe that ends the human experiment. Stop for a moment and let that sink in, because maybe that's the real lesson of the flood myths. Maybe they're not just recording what happened, they're warning us about what will happen. They're saying, look, this has happened before. It will happen again. And you need to prepare. You need to choose. You need to decide what matters. What's worth preserving? What knowledge should survive? What values should guide the next age? And maybe the reason the texts were preserved The reason the Book of Jubilees was hidden in Ethiopian monasteries and the Book of Enoch was copied by scribes who risked their lives. Maybe the reason the megalithic structures were built to last forever and aligned to track the precessional cycle. Maybe all of this is a message from the survivors of the last catastrophe to the survivors of the next one. Saying we were here, we tried to warn you, we preserved what we could. And now it's your turn. Your responsibility. Your choice. And the clock is ticking. The cycle is turning. The age is ending. You're lying down now, wherever you are, and the weight of 12 episodes is settling into your bones like sediment, like layers of time compressed into understanding. And maybe you're tired. Exhausted from the journey. From the questions that don't have easy answers. From the evidence that doesn't fit the narratives you were taught. Or maybe you're exhilarated, energized, feeling like you've finally found the thread that connects everything, the pattern that explains the mysteries, the key that unlocks doors you didn't even know were closed. And both feelings are valid. Both are appropriate responses to what we've discovered together. Because this isn't comfortable knowledge. This isn't the kind of information that lets you sleep easily. This is the kind of truth that changes how you see the world, how you understand history, how you think about the future and your place in it. The flood happened, not as myth but as history, not as local event but as global catastrophe. The evidence is there in the genetic bottleneck, in the geological record, in the simultaneous rise of civilization in multiple locations. In the myths that every culture preserved. And the survivors were real. 8 people according to Genesis. Perhaps a few thousand according to genetics. Scattered groups clinging to life in the aftermath of climate chaos and rising waters and the extinction of the megafauna and the collapse of everything they'd known. And they were taught, that's the part that matters most. They didn't rebuild alone. They didn't figure it out through trial and error over thousands of years. They were instructed, guided, given knowledge that allowed them to create civilization within a few generations. And the teachers, whoever they were, human survivors carrying knowledge from the pre-flood world, or watchers returning under divine supervision, or Anunnaki, resuming their management of their genetic experiment, or something stranger that we haven't imagined. They did their job. They preserved enough knowledge to restart civilization, to ensure that humanity didn't fall back into complete barbarism. And then they withdrew. They stepped back. They became hidden. And we've been living in their absence for 12,000 years, building on foundations they laid, following patterns they established, moving through cycles they encoded in stone and calendar systems. So if you're listening right now, if you've stayed with me through 12 episodes of evidence and questions and uncomfortable implications, then you're part of something important. You're part of a group that's willing to look, willing to question, willing to consider possibilities that the mainstream dismisses. And that matters, that's valuable. That's exactly what the survivors of the last catastrophe did. They looked at the evidence, they preserved the knowledge, they prepared for what was coming, and some of them survived, and they taught, and civilization continued. And maybe that's your role now. Maybe you're being prepared. Maybe the fact that you're hearing this, that you're thinking about these things, that you're starting to see the pattern, maybe that's not coincidence. Maybe you're being called, chosen, prepared for something. And I don't know what that something is. I don't have all the answers. I'm just following the evidence, asking the questions, trying to see clearly. But I do know this: the pattern is real, the cycle is real, the catastrophes happen, the survivors teach, the knowledge gets passed down. And we're living inside that pattern right now. And what you do with this information, how you respond to it, whether you dismiss it or embrace it or investigate further, that's your choice. That's your responsibility. And nobody can make it for you. But I want to invite you, one more time, to continue this journey with me, because this episode, this 12th installment, it's not the end. It's a waypoint. It's one piece of a much larger puzzle that we're assembling together across 50 episodes. And each episode reveals another layer, another connection, another reason why certain texts were removed from the Bible and hidden in Ethiopian monasteries where most people would never find them. And if you've made it this far, if something inside you resonates with these questions, with this investigation, with this attempt to see history clearly without the filters and the narratives and the comfortable lies we've been taught, then I need you to do something for me. I need you to subscribe to this channel, hit that button, turn on notifications, because the episodes that are coming, the ones we're building toward, they're going to go deeper. They're going to examine the bloodlines, the royal genealogies, the claims of divine descent, the question of whether the rulers of the ancient world were human or something else, and whether that something else is still ruling now, still in power, still waiting for the return of the teachers who made them what they are. And if you found this valuable, if it made you think, if it challenged assumptions you didn't even know you had, then like this video, leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me which theory makes the most sense to you. Tell me what questions you still have. Because this isn't a monologue. This is a conversation. This is a community of people who are willing to ask hard questions and look at uncomfortable evidence and think for themselves. And you're part of that now. You're in the investigation. And your voice matters. Your questions matter. Your insights matter. And if you want to save this for later, if you want to come back to it, if you want to share it with someone who's ready to see the pattern, add it to your playlist, bookmark it, send it to that friend who's always asking the same questions you are. Because what we're building here, what we're uncovering across these 50 episodes, it's something no one has ever attempted before. A comprehensive survey of hidden biblical history. An attempt to recover what was lost. To see what's been hidden. To understand the pattern that shapes human civilization. Take a breath. Let it out slowly. And know that the journey continues. The mystery deepens. There are more episodes coming. More evidence to examine. More questions to ask. And I'll be here. Whenever you're ready. Holding the thread. Waiting to lead you deeper. Into the places where history becomes myth and myth becomes memory and memory becomes knowledge. The kind of knowledge that can't be taken away. The kind that survives floods and fires and the endless turning of ages. And that knowledge is yours if you're willing to claim it. So rest now. Let the information settle. Let the questions work on you. Dream about temples buried under sand. About teachers who walked among the ruins. About survivors who refused to forget. And when you wake, we'll continue. Because the story isn't finished. The mystery isn't solved. The next episode is waiting. And the truth, whatever it is closer than you think. And maybe, just maybe, we're the ones who are supposed to find it. We're the ones who are supposed to remember. We're the ones who are supposed to be ready when the cycle turns again. And if that's true, if we're living in the pause before the next breaking, then every moment matters. Every choice counts. Every piece of knowledge preserved might be the difference between survival and extinction, between remembering and forgetting, between the continuation of the pattern and its ending. And I believe you're here for a reason. I believe you've been led to these questions. And I believe that together, across these 50 episodes, we're going to find answers that change everything. So stay with me. Keep questioning. Keep searching. And I'll see you in the next episode. where we'll dive into the bloodlines of the kings, into the question of divine descent, into the possibility that the rulers of the ancient world were something more than human, and that their descendants are still here, still ruling, still waiting, and the path continues. And the mysteries deepen. And you're exactly where you're supposed to be.